Welcome, everybody. My name is Mikey Mhenna. I am the Executive Director of afikra. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to welcome our very, very special guest, Karl Sharro. Karl is an architect, a satirist, and commentator on the Middle East. He's a partner at PLP Architecture in London and co-author of Manifesto towards a new humanitarian humanism in architecture, which was included in 100 artists' manifestos from the futurists to the Stuckists.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right? Okay, good.
Yeah.
He has practiced architecture in London and Beirut and taught for 5 years at AUB in Beirut. He is also the author of And Then God Created the Middle East and Said, Let There Be Breaking News. Karl, thank you so much for joining afikra conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. You have such a great community, and I'm glad to be here.
Oh, it's our pleasure. I want to talk a little bit about what I think people know you less for, and then later on we'll talk a little bit more about Karl reMarks. But you're an architect. That's the first sentence in your byline. When did you become interested in architecture?
I think I've always sort of had an interest in architecture because I used to love to draw, and my mother was actually kind of an established painter, and it kind of makes you interested in the more creative fields. But really, the interest came about the age of 18. I don't want to tell a very embarrassing story about when I started studying in UB, and in the first year I actually applied by mistake to an engineering specialty before I then realized my mistake. But luckily I missed the exam on that, so I had to miss a year out. It was a very embarrassing story, wasted a year of my life, but ultimately ended up in me studying architecture at the UB. And it's great. I enjoyed it, enjoyed studying it, and I still enjoy it. I think it's a great discipline.
Were you always in, when I looked up a lot of your work online, it seemed like you're most interested in system design, in how cities are put together and city life. Have you always been interested in city life in particular, like urban studies?
Yeah, I think, my story of my life is a story of constantly moving to larger cities, and it's basically kind of going from Zahle to Beirut and Beirut to London. And I'm really a city creature. Even in London, I live in a kind of very relatively central location because I have this passion for cities. I grew up between, Damascus, Baghdad, Zahle, Beirut. And I have this passion for cities, and that kind of continues as a theme through my architecture curiosity. And also it kind of sustains this interest in looking at what the future of cities is going to be. And there's something we might come back to is I feel we've been hearing a lot about this, particularly in the last 20 years. There's a lot of enthusiasm about cities, but I think when COVID came, we discovered it's all fake. It's very superficial, because what people thought cities meant, or where they're talking about cities, wasn't really what cities represent. So I feel like there's almost now a moment of betrayal of cities, a moment of abandonment of cities. And that's why I always try to kind of focus at the core about what makes cities interesting. And for me, it's this ability to bring people together. It's the ability to generate frictions and creative tensions. And that comes with a lot of obviously negative baggage. You only need to look at a place like Beirut with its history, but also it's a space for great creativity and interaction. But with that comes something very distinctive, which is the messiness, even the dirtiness, the chaotic nature of cities, which I think is really fantastic. But I feel a lot of people are trying to tame that now. And it's something I want to try to push back against.
So we spoke briefly before the call about this, and I think there's a good time to jump into it. A lot of the work that I saw that you've delivered, some of the lectures you've delivered online, including the one that I've screenshotted here, Arab City Thoughts on Urbanism, which I highly recommend people go check out after this, is talking about, how sort of cities in the Arab world or globally might change over time, over the next 10, 50, 100 years. And as we were talking, I was thinking, a lot of these cities are defined by the office space, and office spaces and work culture is going to change dramatically. We've seen it happen during the pandemic. As somebody who has sort of an eye on this development, what do you think cities look like in the Arab world in 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. And this part of research that we're working on, that we're trying to kind of get a publication out of it with the notion of the new Arab city, because essentially, particularly when you look at regions like the Gulf, there's such a rapid scale of development.
Yeah.
And to an extent where most European cities or Western cities don't really have to experience. And my sense in starting this was there's kind of an absence of a model for what is the right form of the city that's fitting of its culture and aspirations. And there's a lot of borrowing of different ideas. And the image actually that you see in there is a representation of this notion where people used to say to me that Dubai is like, there's too much going on. And the idea was like, no, there isn't enough going on. So, the city only goes vertically. I think it needs to be connected horizontally at multiple levels. So it's kind of like, at some point, I called it Dubai Max, is this idea of magnifying it and then trying to reclaim space for human interaction. Now, the problem when you look particularly at offices is they occupy big chunks of our cities, but they're kind of monocultural, and you look at a place where I work in, which is the city of London, which used to have 300, 400,000 people working in it. And now I still go to the office occasionally and there's hardly anyone, but there isn't an infrastructure for anything else in there. So the problem isn't the offices themselves, is that they're not embedded in an environment that can cater for kind of a more mixed use activity, a sense of kind of cultural interaction, something to keep them going beyond hours. And that's precisely the energy I love about cities and the things that I'm thinking on. But I have to say something about COVID. When people kind of project this total abandonment of cities, I think it's people don't really appreciate how resilient and adaptable cities are and how can they transform themselves. And it's something we might pick up a little bit on, but it's these kind of thoughts that I wanted to bring to the Middle Eastern context. And as we said, we started with Gulf cities and cities like Dubai.
So I'm sure other people will bring this up in the chat later on. So I'm going to try to move on. You published this chapter, this essay, and I was curious, how do you define a new humanism in architecture?
So humanism is a very contentious term because if you look broadly at the social sciences now, they're broadly antagonistic to the notion of humanism, the notion of kind of centering human beings at the center of our kind of philosophical and cultural outlook and sociological outlook. And that's a project that kind of gains momentum with the Renaissance and has different manifestations after that. And I think the thought from writing the manifesto at the time, and there's quite a bit of time has passed since then, and my thinking on a lot of aspects has changed, but it was a bit of a provocative statement to say we need to be able to assess everything in terms of its benefit for humanity and human beings and how we can center them at the expense of that. Because part of what you've been seeing for the last 2 or 3 decades, roughly since the end of the Cold War, is a kind of lack of ambition broadly, globally. And it's something we're going to discover in the recovery phase post-COVID, that there's a lot of kind of cultural anxiety about change, a lot of reluctance to experiment and kind of play it safe and become more conservative. So it was kind of a rallying cry to be bold again and to experiment again. And you see it particularly in the West, where there's societies that are almost atrophying from a lack of this sort of dynamism. And that was really the attempt in admittedly what was quite a provocative manifesto at the time. I mean, I don't know why anyone would write a non-provocative manifesto.
Yeah. Okay, so I was really intrigued by this, this idea that I think I mean, you're smiling throughout this video. There's a video for those of the people who can't see the screens, sort of a little video essay called "A Thousand Mile City" that was covered by the BBC, and it's sort of a tongue-in-cheek video. But I don't think you were joking about this idea. And so I'm curious to hear you talk about the viability of this idea and have you comment on The Line, which was a project that was just announced by MBS, which is this long horizontal city cutting across Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. So I think the idea for this came from Lebanese people will know this in particular. Is driving along the autostrade from Beirut north. I used to live north of Beirut for a while, and just kind of observing how almost, like about a half of the Lebanese coast is now almost one continuous city, although we don't think of it in those terms. And it's clearly, when you look at the Eastern Mediterranean, there's push for being on the coast, right? And the idea was, how can we think of a mega city that extends all the way from Egypt to Turkey, and put aside the geopolitical kind of, because it was a futuristic sort of thing. How do you create a kind of this mega linear city that drags everyone in and creates it starts with like a simple rapid train system and then develops into this mega city that kind of allows for cultural interaction and economic integration. And admittedly, as most things that I do, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. You can see the graphics, for example. But it really was kind of came from this childhood memory that I used to have about, we used to go to Iraq a lot because my mother is from Iraq, and this notion that you can have breakfast in Beirut and lunch in Damascus and dinner in Baghdad, right? And then you talk to the older generation, and it was possible, to have lunch in Beirut, breakfast in Beirut, lunch in Jerusalem or Nablus, and then dinner in Iskandaria, right? It's this kind of connection that seem to have completely been eviscerated, and it's kind of how we try to reclaim that and create a space away from all the kind of political slogans that we're all kind of tired of about Arab unity and all of that, but how do we create actual physical urban space that allows for that interaction?
It's worth mentioning that now with traffic, you can barely have breakfast in Saida, lunch in Beirut, and dinner in Junia. So
I think you'll have lunch, breakfast, and dinner in Beirut, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Thinking about The Line, though, I don't know if you've gotten a chance to look at this project. I was sort of like baffled when I saw it.
So I've seen it, and I think it picks up some things from Masdar, where it was the kind of meant to be the first zero carbon city in the world at the time when it was done. My issue with both, and I'm just like, good luck to anyone who tries new ideas and tries to be kind of very ambitious about them and their potential. And it's something I'm a little bit guilty of myself, because you look at the Dubai slides, is this attempt to separate the kind of the vehicular circulation from the ground plane, and that's a feature of both. I don't know how realistic it is. It might be, again, a provocative thing to kind of generate interest and discussion, so we don't really necessarily know how real it is. But I think in a lot of those ideas, you risk sanitizing spaces too much by separating, these two levels where you have service and mobility, and then you have a kind of a sanitized realm upstairs where people are free to walk and do all kind of thing. I myself am still and I'm kind of a little bit torn about it, but I still love that messiness of cities. So pre-COVID, my favorite places to have coffee in London are on some really loud, noisy sidewalk cafes with lots of cars zooming by. And it's kind of reminds me a lot of Hamra. And it's that kind of, I feel, that element of segregation might produce functioning cities, but it kind of will produce very sanitized spaces. And I think we need to start to break away from that notion from over-sanitized cities.
I couldn't agree more. Okay, I want to transition into almost part two of the interview, talking about your satire. And the same way I asked you about when you first became interested in architecture, who did you read growing up? I told you before the call that when I see your humor, I see a lot of Gary Larson and the Far Side comics. Is there anything else that you like grew up reading or grew up watching? Are you a stand-up comedy fan? Are you a sort of a movie comedy fan? What did you consume?
Yeah, so I'm a big comedy fan, and you know, it started with obviously with movies. It was very hard to get stand up when in the 80s, but I was always like a big fan of lots of sitcoms, starting from like Taxi to Cheers, which I think that whole strand that culminated in Frasier, one of the greatest sitcoms ever done. So there was the kind of the watching aspect. And then there are a number of American writers like Robert Pirsig and Dorothy Parker. A line again that kind of goes through. Somebody gave me the collected writings of Woody Allen when I was at university, and he was absolutely crazy. Like, he was known for his films in the time, he wasn't known for his writing, but I thought it was really amazing. And I think a lot of people see a lot of influences when I used to write my blog in that. So funnily enough, for someone who ended up living in Britain, a lot of my influences were comically were American. But it's like, because I'm not a serious person, I think just kind of like wanting to have a laugh and always crack a joke, and I think it's what sort of pushed me towards this as an excuse. You know, I'm a satirist. It allows me to joke around and be serious about it. I think that's where it comes from, really.
I'm curious, did you grow up watching a ton of Arabic comedy, like Durid Laham or other stuff like that? Do you feel that featured in your comedy?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, you know, his character, Ghawar in particular, we must have watched it, my brother and sister and I, hundreds of times over and over. But it's hard to kind of discern any direct influence there, aside from, you know, just kind of wanting to be funny and looking for ways to be doing funny. And obviously the other one were like the Egyptian series and Egyptian plays and things like that. And still today, I think Egyptians are the funniest people in the world, right? They could just be telling you a simple story that I went to the shop and bought a thing, and you're like, oh my God, that is so funny. Why are you so cute and funny as a people? Which is something I don't feel about us, by the way, as the Lebanese. But there's that influence, but there's also from my Iraqi side, they have this really dark humor for obvious reasons, which I think is a very big influence as well.
Do you, I'm curious about your audience. And if you sort of, you're an analytical person, if you've sort of thought about how to categorize all the different audiences, how do, you know, you're talking about Egyptians and Lebanese and Iraqis, but if you were to sort of categorize the archetypes of your viewers and your fans, is there a very specific British archetype and a very specific American one and a very specific, you know, Arab living in America and Arab living in North Africa, or are there like specific archetypes who take in your humor differently?
I think in general, hi Omar, I just saw Omar popped in now. He's one of my audience, he can talk about himself. I think a lot of them are the people that are in between, kind of like me in a way. So either, you know, people of Middle Eastern descent who live in the West, or Westerners that live in the region or cover the region are interested in it and don't have the patience to learn Arabic. I've just offended half of them now. So I think it's a lot of people that live in the in-betweens, which in today's world, I think it's quite a lot of people really. Is offend them. I have a give a shout to Omar Effendim. Guys, I love his work.
Yeah, afikra conversation alum.
Yeah, I saw.
So yeah, it's people in between. So here's a random question. Do you think your family used to find you funny? Or, I mean, do you consider yourself a funny person? Are you surprised by this this like acclaim that you've been able to acquire? If I
No,
asked your friends growing up and I said Karl Sharro is going to be known for his satire, would they be like, "What are you talking about?"
no, I mean, nobody ever found me funny, and it's like I meet some of them now, and they say to me accusingly, "Okay,
Yeah,
why are you known for being funny?" Like really angry, like why are you know? And I'm like, I don't know, I don't find myself funny, I don't, and I think to be honest, like most people don't necessarily find me funny. I like to think I'm funny. I laugh a lot about my own jokes, so I think a lot
yeah,
of it is just kind of doing things for your own, and if that entertains you and then along the way entertains other people, so be it. But look, it's not my day job. I don't really make any money necessarily out of it, except a bit here and there, so I'm not dependent on it. I can be as flippant as I want about it, and I don't really have to try hard. I just do it. But yeah, I think there's a Lebanese aspect about it, because there's a sense of irony and self-deprecating humor, which I always say this, like in Lebanon, if you make self-deprecating joke, right, people would go like, لا حبيبي ما تقول هيك ما بك شيء, like don't say you're ugly, like there's nothing wrong with you, like you're totally okay.
yeah.
And you're like, no, you completely destroyed it. And so it's, in a way, I became much more at home with the British because of their ability to do that over here. So there's that one aspect, cultural aspect of it.
Yeah. I wonder if you think that, so right now we have up some of the earlier comics in the sort of Phoenician series. Do you think your humor or your style has evolved over time? Do you see an evolution that a casual viewer might not see?
I see a regression, to be honest, because because a lot of this stuff was really raw, and I was really working hard at it in those days, particularly sort of 2011 to 2014, around that period. And I was kind of driven by this sense to kind of, a lot of things were happening, and I wanted to have a voice in it and grow an audience and things like that. And I think it was pretty raw, and I've ended up in a position now where I really don't have the time to sustain the same output. And I've been given so much feedback about it that not necessarily a helpful thing, if you know what I mean. Like, you're better off just kind of doing your own thing and trying to do as good a job as you can, without necessarily kind of people analyzing it and discussing it and things like that. So you get to a stage where, like, how am I gonna top it? And that's not really the right motivation to start working from. But it's a place that I can't quite dissociate myself from at the moment.
Yeah. Like, I was wondering about Twitter as a platform in particular. So you started out, if I may have this wrong, but I think that you started out blogging without being on Twitter first. Am I right about that?
Yeah, the blogging started a bit because basically Twitter didn't exist at the time when I started blogging. I think it was around 2005, 2006, something like that. Yeah.
So I'm curious about Twitter as a platform for you, and if it's changed your comedy, if you think there's the obvious part about restriction, character limit restriction, but even the nature of the platform, does it pull out more snarkiness? Does it pull out more interconnectivity? Does it have an effect on what you say?
I think it's, to be honest, as a medium, I think it's become quite three things: polarized, jaded, and formulaic. And it's something that I'm guilty of myself. I'm not accusing other people, but as a medium, it's sort of marched towards that direction. So you go back to the early days, there was much more scope for experimentation and trying things out. And there are things that I used to say, if I were to say now, people would be like, you'd start getting the offended train, like people would be offended in quite large numbers. And because they choose not to see the irony, they there's this vehicle of, like, whatever you do, somebody's gonna outwalk you at some point in some respect and take away the human. I mean, it's even as simple, I would say, a while back, I tweeted this thing when the British government was completely failing in dealing with COVID, dealing with anything. And I tweeted this thing. Finally, the British know what's it like to be ruled by the British, right? And then I start getting like, a lot of people got it and laughed and blah, blah, blah. And then a lot of people are like, oh, you're downplaying the nature of colonialism. And I'm like, no, I'm not, because anybody who chooses to take their knowledge of how horrible colonialism was from my tweet is wrong to start with. And this is kind of, we've ended up in this tunnel where people kind of want every tweet to be in itself sum your position about everything in the world and explain all the horrors of all of history within the 280 characters. It's kind of this kind of one-upmanship that I feel has taken away a lot of from potential of Twitter to be more free and kind of experimental. But the other one is the kind of the tendency to become formulaic, and you see doing it yourself. You can't start repeating the same patterns, and it's not something you necessarily enjoy, but sometimes like it just kicks in, right? And that's why I feel that period was a little bit more, for me, a little bit more dynamic.
Do you feel yourself being drawn to comment about other things that don't include the Middle East, or do you imagine that you might sort of start pointing your satire on other subject matters altogether, starting like having a new character in a new sort of series? Do you ever feel drawn in those directions?
Yeah, I really want to become a fashion influencer, but you can tell that's not taking off at all. The other really like direction that I want to go into is to mix my favorite two things in the world, which is food and politics. And I did an experiment last year for about a month. Every single tweet I did and kind of snuck them in, combined food and politics. So for example, there was a chart that represented all the Lebanese sects as a tabbouleh ingredients. And it was like kind of a lot of things like that. Where I want to take it, if I ever have the time, I want to do these kind of recipes, because I cook Lebanese food and I think I cook very well. You know, my kibbeh is unsurpassed. And I want to mix that with a commentary on politics. I think that's really the one thing that I wish I had time for.
Fantastic. I'm curious about, I was really, really drawn towards this video, Karl Sharro's stand-up comedy. Are you drawn towards that medium? Do you like actually delivering your comedy out loud?
Yeah, I mean, so I did it once, right? And this was in Edinburgh, I think 2-3 years ago. Mm-hmm. And normally what I do these talks where I have a lot of the stuff that we've shown here. So I would read some of my older blogs that nobody reads anymore and show some of my extremely amateurish videos and, you know, just kind of weave it all through in a sort of PowerPoint / stand-up thing. And it goes like similar to this. It goes for about an hour. And then I got this invite to Edinburgh, and they said at an event organized by great people called Chill Habibi, intentionally Orientalist sounding, but knowingly so, with somebody's sheets hanging in the background, as you can see. And they said, you can do whatever you want. And I thought, it's Edinburgh, it's during the Fringe Festival. I've been so many times there. I love stand-up comedy. It's always been my kind of passion to do it. So what I did for one time only, I did this 45-minute routine. And that was it. I worked on it for a couple of months and performed it only once. But it was a blast. It was great because the audience were fantastic. They, you know, nobody heckled me. They made me feel at home. Half of them, I think, already knew me, knew my work. And I used a lot of my like Twitter material, kind of tried to weave it through into a thread. And I have to say, it's one of the most exhilarating things I've ever done in my life. But that was it. My comedy debut was 45 minutes, and that's it. It's never been performed again. I would love to do it again, but obviously I've got to, like, I have to refresh the material quite a bit.
So do you the new jokes that you're working on now, like, what is your process? Like, walk me through a day in your life. When do you actually put pen to paper? When do you draw new stuff? When do you get on Twitter? Like, are you a highly regimented person, or do you have like a Twitter section on your calendar? Okay, let me get on a tweet. Like, how do you do it? Walk me through your day.
No, so I mean, during COVID, there's no system for anything basically, and there's no time for anything. And COVID has taken the one thing from me, the space where I used to come up with like all my ideas. I used to go cafe in the morning, have a coffee, and sit outside, you know, have a couple of cigarettes, and spend half an hour looking at my phone, being totally antisocial, and then all these ideas would start coming. But then throughout my working day, you know, I would start having these ideas, and then I can't do anything until my lunch break. And it's like a lot of people know this, is most of this work that you see is like basically was limited to what I can do in a lunch break.
Yeah,
and then I would
great.
kind of wait for it, and then we just have to write it quickly or draw it quickly, animate it quickly, and then put it up, and that's it, forget about it. So COVID has taken away a lot of that space, especially, you know, the ability to be on your own and kind of thinking things and have some time, like half an hour in the morning. And you can see that it's really suffering. I don't know how anybody is still following me on Twitter, but please stay with me. They found a vaccine for COVID. They're gonna find a vaccine for my humor. Stick with it, and we'll come out of it all great. It's gonna be great. Yeah, but let's just get over this hump.
Yeah. Do you have, okay, I'm going to switch into the quick Q&A, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So the first question is, what are you reading or watching right now?
I'm really looking forward for season 4 of Fargo, which is not available in the UK. If
With Chris Rock.
Sorry?
With Chris Rock.
No, Fargo, is it with Chris Rock?
Chris Rock's the main character, yeah.
Oh, really? That's amazing. I've avoided looking at anything about it. Oh, that's fantastic. I'm even more curious now. So if anyone can smuggle it to me somehow, I'm dying, because I really like the film. I like the series, and I like a lot of the themes in the work of the Coen brothers, is the kind of trying to make sense of, again, this very specific period of time that we're in and what led to it, and kind of all these threads about how our economy works and how our society works, but this kind of within this biblical God's eye view. I find that really fascinating, so I'm really looking forward to it. In parallel, I'm watching this British series where I didn't watch at the time, which is Life on Mars, about this guy who kind of wakes up, we think he's in a coma, and there's a lot of the stuff that I'm watching and reading has this theme of disorientation and trying to make sense of the world around you. So I've gone back as well. I'm rereading one of my favorite books ever, which is Foucault's Pendulum by Umberto Eco, where, by the way, there's like the only modern Arab quoted in it is Kamal Jumblat. Is this guy has such a encyclopedic knowledge. He brings it into this kind of spoof of the whole conspiracy world. So it's very resonant with what's happening now. The last thing that I'm reading is I'm trying to improve my German. So I'm reading a lot of German children's books, especially about the Dreikopfdrache, which is the three-headed dragon.
Karl, first of all, you have time. Get rid of the German books. You have time to start drawing more. Delete the German children's books. Okay. Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
For a day, okay. I think it will have to be Karl Marx, but not for anything political, because the guy was the life of the party, and he's known for his legendary pub crawls in which he would visit like 20 pubs a night in London. And also he would help me with my German.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. At what age would you like to hang out with Karl Marx?
It's roughly around my age, I think. That's just not to be too differential.
That's fair. Okay.
Which is quite ancient.
Yeah, exactly. What do people most misunderstand about your work?
I think I touched about this a little bit. It's this kind of the sense of irony sometimes doesn't really translate, and people don't understand why you're using that vehicle. But the other one is where I sometimes kind of would intentionally use stereotypes as a way of kind of appropriating stereotypes and kind of that. And then people would take it too literally, right? So if you're talking, I would write a guide about all the sects in the Middle East or in Lebanon, whatever, and people would say, oh, why are you talking about that? You're quite sectarian, completely missing the point. And I think those are the two key ones.
If I can ask as a follow-up, who do you think misunderstands your work the most? Where are these people from? Or what is their background? Is it a monolith of people?
They're from a particular village in Lower Saxony. Now, I'm being extremely evasive because whenever I've answered that question in the past, then I got the same people the next day lining up on Twitter. And it's not like I'm running away from a fight. I just don't have the time for it. So I promise you, as soon as COVID is over and I have more time, I'm going to try to offend more people, and you can have a go at me on Twitter.
Perfect. Okay, whose work do you admire or are inspired by?
Yeah, I think, again, I touched on that a bit in terms of the comedy writers, but the particular artist that I really like, and I think his worldview totally helped shape my thinking in many ways for his kind of levity and bringing fun into things, is Marcel Duchamp. And the Dadaist, the French artist, and it's just, he had this kind of total levity about the world, and that I found so refreshing.
Okay, great. That's fantastic. So we're going to open up the questions. I think the first one is from Alexander. Alexander, you had 2 questions, so if you could only ask one, that would be great.
So I was wondering what you think on the architecture side about private entities such as Sidewalk Labs, which are trying to reinvent completely the definition of cities by leveraging data to, for example, diminish the traffic jam, which raises a lot of questions about democracy and the power of citizens.
Yeah. Do you want me to answer them straight, Mickey?
Yeah, thanks, Alexander.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Alexander, and thank you for sticking with me on Twitter. I'm kind of torn about this tendency because one thing we didn't really have the time to develop on is this kind of tendency of people to talk about cities and the importance of cities for the past 20 years, and kind of themes like making cities denser, making things more sustainable. They pushed a certain agenda that had a completely kind of contradictory outcome. Essentially, we had a whole swathe of urbanists and academics who pushed these ideas that ended up making a lot of cities, not just in the West, you can see it in Beirut, in Amman, and other places, where city centers become exclusively places for the rich. Why? Because they pushed policies that pushed the value of these places, right? And pushed all urban policies towards the center, and kind of like completely trying to disregard the margin. And that was kind of an unintended consequences in their mind. But actually, if you look at the way that they went about it, it kind of, I think it blew up in a completely different direction. So the problem that we get now, particularly when you start to do it by harnessing data and things like that, is you lose again that messiness, and you can't control the unintended consequences. And I don't mean like that to put a lid on experimentation. We should be always able to experiment. But I feel we're relying a lot on techno solutions and kind of big data and these sorts of things to justify our decisions, when I think what we really need to do is be more subjective about it, but be willing to test these ideas in the forum of public debate. So a lot of the time people will resort to modeling, for example, or computer simulations or big data as a way of circumnavigating debate and saying, look, we're doing what the science wants. We're looking what evidence shows, and thereby completely avoiding this friction and contention that can push us to be more creative.
Great. Thanks so much. Melanie, you're up next.
Yes. Hi, Karl. Thanks so much for spending the time with us. It's really exciting to hear you talk as a longtime fan. Appreciate all the chuckles and laughs that I've gotten over the years from your posts. So my question is also about cities. Obviously, public spaces in cities have been hugely, important when we see protest movements and different kinds of social movements for change. So I'm wondering, do you think after sort of COVID subsides, cities will be able to adapt and transform to accommodate new kinds of normals in the way we interact with each other? Or do you think cities will sort of lose their importance when it comes to these kinds of movements and social change? Thanks.
Thanks, Melanie, and thanks again for the long time follow. And it's a really great question. It will allow me kind of project a little bit what I'm thinking at the moment about the kind of the post-COVID future, because as I said earlier, I think there's a lot of doom and gloom from people that don't really appreciate two things. One, the resilience and adaptability of cities, and secondly as well, the kind of the incredible potential that we have at the moment at our disposal. Because a lot of people are saying, you know, you look at things like shopping has been suffering for a long time, and COVID has accelerated that. The tendencies for remote working has increased so much. So there's this kind of fear that cities are going to be abandoned. First of all, I don't think that's going to happen to a significant extent, but we're able to factor these things into our daily schedules. But life is going to change to a certain extent. And if we are purposeful about the way we deal with it, we can make it a positive transformation. And I'll give an example of that. So there's this massive freak out that you know, real estate prices are going to drop in cities because people would want to live in the countryside or suburbs or wherever. And I see that as a great opportunity, because if you look at cities across the globe, the really big problem across the last 20 years is cities have been becoming increasingly unaffordable and kicking people out and out and out, right? Very essential people, very key people for the functioning of these cities have been priced out, or they have to compute for a long time or accept smaller accommodation. So there's an opportunity now, if there's a genuine kind of devaluation of that, to try to reclaim cities and try to kind of make them diverse once again, socioeconomically. You know, there's all sorts of things we can do with the structures that exist to adapt them to new uses, to bringing even industry back into cities, bringing culture back into cities in a bigger way, bringing amenities, finding new ways of inhabiting them, because not everybody wants to live in the suburbs, right? So I think the key message, because we don't have the time to really develop it to that extent, is there's a kind of historic opportunity here to reverse something that is very bad that's been happening for the last few decades, which is kind of made cities much more exclusive. And if we are clever about it, I think this would be the right opportunity. But it needs investment, it needs political will, it needs grassroots action to kind of demand these things for sure, but the opportunity is there.
Great, thanks Melanie, that was a great question. Next question comes from Ahmad.
Hey, Karl. I just want to also thank you for everything that you do. Huge fan, as you know, and just really appreciate the diversity of your background. You know, I studied architecture as well, and I have, you know, a whole host of things that I'm involved in. But I'm just curious, actually, I'd asked a question in the chat. If Twitter was invented by a Middle Eastern person, how would it be different? But I'm also, in addition to that, because I think you even tweeted about that before, but I think if Twitter was a physical space, would you go there?
Thanks a lot, man. And I have to say, we have to make something together one day, but I don't know what it is. It's probably a building that doesn't stand up, or the doors don't work, or something like that. This is like an obsession of mine. What if it was like Twitter was a physical space? What would it look like? And I've always tried to represent it, and it's been such a massive failure. But I think what it really, and this is an old tweet of mine, what really like the Arab or Middle Eastern version of it is, you know, when I was a kid, my dad used to take me to the cafe, where like predominantly only men sitting there, smoking argile, playing taule, drinking tea, and just basically spending the day talking about politics. And then at that point, I had realized that's exactly what I do on Twitter, right? So that was it. It was like the Arab version of it would be the ahwe, the cafe, the coffee shop.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to read, thanks Hamad. I'm going to read Rania's question because her mic is not working. She's saying, Karl, are you planning a sequel to And Then God Created the Middle East and Said, Let There Be Breaking News?
Yeah, I mean, sequel is a very glorified term, but thank you for your question. I think my aspiration was always, because, you know, most effort and passion that have gone into my blog posts, that obviously, because it's the medium, is nobody kind of reads them anymore. So I've always wanted to collect them into some sort of book. And to be able, the problem with trying to do that is, publishing being the way it is, it won't be affordable, and you know, I don't feel comfortable putting something that's not affordable out there. And I'm really grateful for everyone who's actually gone out and bought, and thank God, because you know, it was a great recognition of a lot of the work and allowed me at least to document it in a way that would be preserved should Twitter disappear one day. So that was really great. The only problem with that is bringing the material a little bit up to date, which I think could be done. But the other one is trying to find a way to get around the affordability issue, because I don't want to end up, you know, doing a book of blog posts that's going to cost $15, $20. So hopefully I will find a solution, but I think that's the aspiration. And then moving on from that, after I document that, I've got lots of ideas, but it's again, the time.
How do you sort of envision, I'm going to, Farah is up next, but just on this topic, how do you sort of define success for a project like that? Is it successful the minute it's published, as in, hey, I got it out, that's really what I wanted to do. If 1 million people can read it, great. If 100 people can read it, that's fine too.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, really, because I realized with And God how much like goodwill there is towards me out there, which was really touching, because I think, you know, people were very excited about it, despite knowing most of the material, despite the fact that the book wasn't very big. But it's like, you see it in a lot of places. A lot of people send me pictures with it. A lot of people say, oh, that made me laugh so much. And that to me is a much bigger success than anything like sales figure or anything like that. And I've always wanted to do it primarily because I wanted the record somewhere of this stuff. So that one level. But if you go about like this kind of stuff in general, I mean, obviously when you do something that goes massively viral, there's a huge sense of reward with that. But like some of my, I think, funniest thing I've written, right? They've been read by like 50 people, but those 50 people that read them really got it and really loved them. Like I did this alternative cinema analysis of Syrian rebel videos, right? It was like a massive scoop, I think back in Spoof in 2013. And it was all kind of riffing on themes of German expressionist cinema and art critique. And it was like about 50 people like found it totally hilarious. And then there's 7 other billion people on the planet totally ignored it. For me, it's still a great success, right? Despite, you know, one time trying to present it in a conference of all places in Germany, where I was, and Nat Muller, who's on the call, I think was in the room that day. And I didn't get a single laugh for 45 minutes, stone-faced audience completely. So despite suffering my biggest embarrassment ever through it, I still love that piece. Yeah, that's success, I think.
That's awesome. What an ideal answer. Okay, Farah, you're up next.
I've been following you for a few years, Karl, on Twitter. My question is, how has the pandemic influenced or impacted your humor? Do you feel like it's gotten more cynical, more towards satire, or is it actually in another direction that you haven't expected?
I mean, really, I think it's mainly influenced my humor by depriving me totally of material. You know, there's so much you can do when you're locked between 4 walls. And people early on, I think it was in March when I did this very long thread on Twitter, and it was literally a thread. Like I ran a thread in the flat and took one picture after the other, and people already thought that I was going crazy in the first week. So there was one theme that kind of emerged in a big time during the pandemic, which was this kind of like the world is becoming inverted now, because African countries were saying, we don't want these Europeans coming here and bringing their viruses. And I love that sort of theme. I worked on it a lot. But then as everything else, you know, it gets tired after a while. And at the same time, it's like very hard to sustain a kind of a decent comic reaction when nothing is changing. You know, you wake up every day and it's like everything is the same and things repeat. And sometimes like I look at my watch and I notice I finished drinking my coffee at exact same time every day. And it's just so depressing not to have that deviation. Maybe I've been like not really good at taking advantage of this opportunity and trying to kind of experiment a little bit more. Who knows? Hopefully there won't be time to kind of we'll come out of this soon, and I won't have to be in this predicament for longer. But I promise you, if it does extend, I'm going to do my geopolitical recipes.
Great. Last question from Dima.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the lovely conversation. My question is, what do you find most powerful or compelling about satire? And do you think satire can change the world?
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's, that's a really important question. I've always used to kind of answer it by saying, no, I don't really think it can change the world. And I sort of, try to push this more because I see a lot of like self-aggrandizing people who kind of posit themselves in this very heroic role and kind of try to say like what they're doing is kind of this heroic task and satire is going to transform the world. And I don't think so, I don't think so. I think satire can work at the level of a tiny part of our ability to think differently and critically about the world, but it also can bring us together in different ways. It can expose people to how they are perceived, how other people are perceived, how their relationships are put together. But above all, I think, it can be fun as well, which I think a lot of like kind of these serious satirists kind of don't recognize, right? So it might change the world in like a very, very tiny, minuscule way, but I'm very wary of any kind of heroic claims around it. Having said all of that, and this is kind of a standard answer that I give all the time, because you've seen a lot of my kind of anti-ISIS material, and the people that were in the region kind of trying to mock ISIS at the height of their strength, I think that was very brave. And it might not have like defeated ISIS physically, but to take that stance for who we are and what we want to be and away from that barbaric vision, when you're kind of in the midst of that, not from the safety of London like I'm doing it, that's hugely brave. Those people can change the world, absolutely.
Amazing. Thanks, Dima, for that question. Okay, Karl, I'm going to end with one final question. Who do you think we should interview next? Not as in next on Thursday, but if you were to recommend somebody from your world who you think is either doing great work documenting the histories and cultures of the Arab world or helping shape the histories and cultures of the Arab world, who would you nominate?
Oh my God, it's not because I can't think of people, but I'm thinking, whom do you choose?
Sure.
From all these people? You're kind of putting me on the spot. I can't answer that. I can't answer. There's so many names coming into my head now, and I don't want to like be seen to.
That's fair.
Kind of pick someone over someone else. I can't answer that. I'm really sorry.
That's totally fair. Karl, thank you so much for doing this. For all of you who can't see the screen, you can follow Karl's work at Karl reMarks. If you look him up on YouTube, I highly recommend checking out some of his talks about architecture. It was fantastic.
Thank you so much for this. It's been great. And thanks everybody for sticking with it. I really appreciate it.
Thanks everybody. Enjoy your day, enjoy your night, wherever you are. Stay safe.